start recording here. All right. Wonderful. So our ghost panel on consumer mainnet and how can we get end consumers to adopt mainnet at scale. Thank you for the wonderful panelists, Evin McMullen, Natalia Romiszewski, and Robert Greenfield to discuss what needs to be done from a business, product, and technology perspective. I'm Andreas Freund, your host and moderator for this ghost panel. But I hope that it will actually produce some very, very wonderful content. Why don't we go quickly around our illustrious panel with a round of introduction. And Evin, why don't you kick us off? You always do such a good job with that.
Thank you, Andreas. Super excited to be here with all of you. So I'm Evin McMullen. I work mostly on user-facing experiences built with an Ethereum backend, and that's everything from end users who know nothing about the protocol to developers engaging with dev tools and middleware. Most recently, I've been focused on the entertainment space, so thinking about how people who are operating out in the world, just being regular citizens, might benefit from blockchain-based experiences. But with my experience launching contracts on Mainnet, I definitely understand some of the usability challenges that we face there. So really excited to dig into some of the blockers and opportunities we have to scale Mainnet adoption.
Thank you, Evin. Natalia, why don't you go next?
I'm Natalia. I come from the entertainment industry where I worked in business law for about 15 years across music supervision, licensing, and more. And I joined Consensus in 2017 to explore the usability of blockchain to fix inherent problems in the music industry, royalty collection, artist management, etc., fan engagement. And yeah, I've gained a lot of insight into both worlds and how they could work better together and use each other's tools to make blockchain a more consumer-friendly, adoptable technology.
Thank you. Wonderful. Robby.
Yeah, absolutely. So Robert Greenfield, I'm Consensus alum, and former head of social impact over there. My experience has been in the social sector, so how to deploy dApps in emerging markets, so typically markets where you have very low connectivity and very low literacy. Today, I'm CEO of Emerging Impact, and we support major NGOs and government agencies to leverage emerging technologies like blockchain in their social protection and emerging or economic empowerment programming.
Thank you, Robby. I'm your host and moderator, Andreas Freund, carrying the title of the Blockchain Swiss Army Knife, and I have been working with all three of you on various projects in the blockchain space, most recently on entertainment, and happy to have you guys here. The goal for us all is how can we get blockchain adoption, especially Ethereum mainnet, at scale. And let us kick us off with the first question to you guys, and then just go around the room, and everyone can give an answer to that. So my first question is, what are currently the biggest hurdles for end consumers to adopt a mainnet-based product at a meaningful scale, and what needs to be done to overcome these hurdles? Robby, why don't you take this one first?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really see it in two separate categories. The first, obviously, is user experience. So what a layman user sees when they're interacting with a blockchain-enabled application, and the second, obviously deals with mainnet itself and layer one and the issue of state explosion. For the former. And we're starting to see a gradual evolution in terms of how applications present themselves, looking more traditional, being mobile friendly, but it's still been a very long road. You still see a lot of applications that require self-custody of private keys. Even still, some use the signage of transactions, and I think that's just a huge barrier toward adoption. And slowly but surely, hopefully, organizations understand that, people want meta transactions signed on the back end. They don't want to deal with that. They want to have that same experience just as any other application. In my particular context, working in emerging markets where most people cannot read, cannot write, and so they're certainly not technically literate, it's really just simplicity. Oftentimes, a lot of these applications use up a lot of bandwidth, and they're not necessarily great for people who are trying to do simple things like send transactions. So, we hear this beckon and call of a lot of organizations that say, we're developing this for financial inclusion, or even in an enterprise finance space, we're trying to, tokenize securities. But I think a lot of those, best practices for UX that apply to Web 2.0 trend, applications still haven't quite made it, to the DApp world. And then, quick bit on, on state explosion. Obviously, we're progressing into, have been for a while into ETH 2.0. But I think there's this innate issue in really needing to separate the computation layer from the state layer. And we see this materialize in two ways. One, an over-reliance, even though enterprise Ethereum is great and things like Hyperledger Vesu are great, we start to see, the commercial usage of those much more than we actually see applications developed on Mainnet itself, which I think is slowing the progress as how that, that it's developing. It's kind of just becoming an archetype template that, all the, enterprise blockchains leverage. And, the second thing obviously is this just a more open discussion as to, how these things progress. And I know, Evin, you mentioned this a little bit earlier. I would hope that we would increasingly use stages like DevCon to talk about these things more outwardly, not in a debate fashion, but in a way as how we can get better. Because we're seeing oncoming blockchains starting to implement this separation, like the Nervoses, like the Celos, et cetera. Yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Natalia, you want to give your take from an industry point of view?
Yeah, from a less technical point of view, yeah, I agree. It's usability and it's UX. Most people, even though they can read and write in the entertainment space, are still not very technically capable. I mean, a lot of people don't even hear Spotify, so that goes to show how much people really invest in technology and usability. So from my experience, having worked with people who are developing products for the entertainment space, I also found a lot of the design was led by engineers as opposed to doing more user testing or having the design come from the people that had the problem or the people who were actually needed the solution to be built for them. So I find that blockchain tends to be a lot of back-end heavy, bulky infrastructure, like you said. It's slow. Sometimes there tends to be too much blockchain when there could be more Web 2. Building a product entirely out of blockchain, I have found, does not necessarily work. So just really just scaling it down, making it super simple, using those Web 2 principles, and using blockchain what blockchain is good for, preserving privacy, and encryption, and just those few tools that we really have gotten to a good place with, where we are with Ethereum right now, as opposed to trying to build everything with innovative tools that haven't necessarily have all the kinks worked out.
Could not agree more. Evin, product market fit of end consumer products in blockchain. What is the product view here that is judging by your smile and shaking of your head? There's a big takedown coming right about now.
Oh, I could not agree more with everything that Natalia and Robby just outlined. I definitely agree that, as Robby defined, they're really sort of bifurcating this question into what are the challenges to end users that prohibit them from effectively engaging with today's dApps, so the dApps that we have right now, that are on Mainnet, versus what are the technical challenges that limit enterprises from integrating Mainnet technology into their other dApp offerings. So in the first instance, you know, why is it that people like you and me and our friends and the people around us are blocked from or having difficulty engaging with mainnet projects today? And I think, you know, Robby and Natalia touched on it around like the technical usability. So key management, that's a big challenge for most end users. But really, I think a big issue that we often forget is like relevance. There are not a ton of decentralized applications that solve everyday problems or provide everyday amusement, engagement in the same way that Candy Crush helps me not be bored, and that Seamless helps me get food, in that Visa helps me pay my bills, and that Facebook helps me realize that my grandmother has a long way to go. So, you know, there are a lot of, you know, I guess for lack of a better phrase, dopamine hits that the app layer provides us that are, you know, fun and engaging and entertaining. Then there are those functional services or actions that we need to take in the course of our daily lives existing in the world as human beings that can be made more easy or can be made more accessible through applications. And it's those anchoring in with a little bit of blockchain where it delivers business value that I think the biggest opportunity for mass adoption is. If we make blockchain, if we utilize some of blockchain's superpowers, like write once, never erase, and you inject that into something like, I don't know, your test scores or your credentials or your police, complaint records, then you're going to be able to entrust in that data in a more meaningful way than you can today. And trustable data can be a helpful part of those, you know, everyday obligatory applications that we want to engage with. But that leads me to the second half of our bifurcated question, which is what are the technical challenges that limit enterprises from even serving up blockchain apps in the first place to our users? So, you know, to echo the challenges on, you know, scalability, obviously moving from ETH1 to ETH2, we've got a transaction time challenge, right? You know, ETH1, we're like 12, 15 seconds or 15 transactions a second, whereas Visa's like, cool, how about like 2,000, you know, 2 million, right? and that's just not a scale that we can meaningfully engage in this moment. But even if we wanted to scale up to, you know, 2 million transactions a second, we are at a point of technical immaturity in the network. We do not know what scale looks like because a lot of these things haven't even been proven out at a petri dish level. So for example, you know, everybody loves the example of CryptoKitties, you know, the great success of engagement with end user interaction with Ethereum. But, you know, 14, 15% of the network later, and we have, you know, transaction delays and rising transaction costs, all these unexpected consequences that come from the rapid scaling of a single experiment. And so I say all of this because for an enterprise client, they're unlikely to stick their neck out so far to try to, you know, develop a new solution and then scale it without any precedent, with, you know, a limited talent pool because there aren't a ton of blockchain engineers out there, and rising costs of, you know, of ETH2 applications as the stateless nature of the POS network increases those app layer costs for traditionally designed apps, or otherwise require you to, you know, proactively shape your applications to skirt those costs. So anyway, I mean, this is a lot. This is asking a lot of a business when that business is still trying to sort out, where do I use this? And so anyway, these are a lot of big challenges, but I think it comes down to relevance. You know, are you picking the right problem? You know, usability. Are you introducing that problem to your audience in a way that's meaningful and tangible to them? And then 3 is just sort of technical immaturity. Like we don't really know what exactly is going to be that killer integration. But right now, I think the blockchain ecosystem is putting a lot of that intellectual labor on our clients. And we're asking these companies, these enterprises, can you guys you tell us what you want? You know, you Sony Music, you Goldman Sachs, you know, I don't know, whatever company, Microsoft, name here, or Microsoft knows what they want a little bit more, but, you know, Adidas. Asking them to perform the intellectual labor to answer all of the questions that I just outlined is a lot. And so we, you know, as those who can sit in that translational liminal role, have a duty to provide a little bit of handholding on both sides.
Yep, exactly. I want to take that and dig in a little deeper, and I want to like compare and contrast sort of like what are like the end consumer requirements and the enterprise requirements and how they compare to one another, and what does that mean for products. And I think like music and entertainment is a great spot to sort of like highlight that. That's why I want to go to you, Natalia, and like ask you, so like from an end consumer point of view, like a Spotify user, right, to, you know, an artist, to a record label, right? What are the differences and expectations of a product, and how could you potentially even think about squaring that with the current capabilities of a blockchain, let alone a public blockchain?
Okay, so you're asking me what kind of use cases would work best?
Yeah, what are the expectations from a true consumer point of view? What would they would they expect versus what the enterprises want of that? Because there seems to be a significant difference, dichotomy between what enterprises are saying, oh, we need like security, blah blah blah, everything out to the wazoo, versus the end consumer is like, just make the shit work.
Right. Well, I think both want the same thing. I think kind of anything that either saves you time, makes you money, saves you time, makes you money, makes things easier for you. That's what both enterprise and consumers want, I would like to say. I mean, consumers, just like, people don't really care how a Tesla works. They just want to get in and drive it, and they know that it's electronic, so it saves them money. So that's why people gravitate towards that. Like when people get on airplanes, they don't really care to know how the airplane works. They just want to know that it works and that it's going to get you from point A to point B without killing you. And I would like to think the same thing about products. I think there's a lot of focus in blockchain and the blockchain world about why blockchain, or how blockchain works, or this is so exciting because of blockchain, as opposed to focusing on the actual usability of the product and what it does to make your life easier and why that's important, or what it does to, you know, protect your privacy, what it does to save you money, what it does to make the world a better place, as opposed to look at this really cool blockchain feature that we have. So I find that to be a lot of problem in terms of like on the blockchain end, trying to get consumers to adopt their product, because people don't really care about that. In terms of enterprise, I agree with what Evin said. There's not a lot of people inside of those businesses that have a fundamental knowledge of blockchain and how to actually integrate, you know, those products into these massive, you know, infrastructures that have been around. I mean, the music business has been around and has been a mess since, you know, the 1930s, and no one's figured it out. So the theory that you could put all the royalties and all the intellectual property and copyrights on blockchain, and that way you would be able to know every time someone plays your song, is a beautiful theory. However, the implementation of that is near impossible. And the desire for that, and all the people that are profiting from the black box that is the music industry and not knowing, like, you know, how royalties get paid out, they're not going to want to change that. So I think there's a lot of just kind of a mixture between like reality and expectation that's happening. However, after, you know, speaking to a lot of record executives, you know, just things like simplifying the internal process at record labels and how paperwork gets pushed and how signatures get signed, and, you know, consumer, like there's so many simple things that could be adapted now versus trying to solve, you know, these massive problems that are on such a large scale that I don't think that we're really prepared to do that right now. So I think the important thing to focus on when developing products or developing anything with blockchain or anything really is like, start with a really simple problem, solve that one problem, gain that trust and credibility as a solution, and then you can go on to, you know, save the world. I mean, Uber started with one problem. You couldn't get a taxi in San Francisco. Now Uber is a way of life. It's become, you know, a phrase that we adopt towards getting something delivered to your front door. So I think, does that answer your question in terms of just a kind of expectation, both on an enterprise and consumer level? It just, again, everything just needs to be simplified, because everyone's so excited about blockchain, but they're forgetting about the fact that people need to use it, and it has to save us time and money. And until it does that, I just don't really see people caring that much. People cared about crypto for a while, but people forget that crypto and blockchain are kind of two separate things. And a lot of people lost a lot of money in crypto, so they have a bad taste in their mouth as well. So we have to also come back from that.
Thank you. I think there's some really, I want to take off of what you just said and hand it over to Evin one more time on the, you know, on the product side, what Natalia just said. What is that before I go to the technical side and you, Robby, because you're then asked to actually build this stuff. But it's like from a product side, what Natalia just said, what does that actually mean? When you're talking about product market fit, features, and all of that good stuff that typically gets wrapped up in just two letters, UX. So
Totally. Yeah. So, so conversation number one, the first layer of the cake is what Natalia set us up for in terms of expectations on both sides. That second layer of like how you meet those expectations, where the rubber hits the road, is really in the form of like tangible, usable output. And that's the same for the client side as it is the user side. So on the user side, tangible, concrete output means I need to be able to interact with whatever experience you're putting in front of me in a way that requires minimal learning, that requires, a very limited set of ways that I can screw up. So you've got a pretty, straightforward path. You've got a simplistic user interface and a user journey. That user needs to be able to effectively, obviously, understand what they're doing in that application layer, perform the desired activity, and not get locked out forever if they lose their key. Because as Robby noted at the beginning of this conversation, key management persists as one of the greatest challenges around allowing users the autonomous control of the data that they generate. If you want to give them an asset and make them curator of it, you have to give them the tools that allow them to care for it in a way that works for them. So so on that user side, the element of blockchain, the need for blockchain to be at the forefront of the user experience is nil. For every internet-based or online web-based project I've ever worked on, like we've never had a debate around like what is the importance or role of TCP/IP protocols here. We've just said let's make a website. And so I think what is the role of TCP/IP protocols vis-a-vis our user? Do they need to know about those protocols? Do they have to engage with them? Do they have questions about them? Probably not, because they're just trying to go to a website. So I think one of the big victories for user-facing mainnet applications today are those that obfuscate the blockchain bit, that don't tell you, what's going on in the guts of the application, but rather just help you get from point A to point B to accomplish your goal. So one example of a dApp that does this really well, that's on Mainnet, is HCAPTCHA. It's a replacement for reCAPTCHA that just does sort of human verification on websites, but it allows for the preservation of user privacy, the ingestion of images that require processing from a third party, and then it allows the website as an agent to derive some value by enabling this whole process. So the nice thing there is it's really tangible, it's straightforward, it's easy to learn, it doesn't require a lot of technical understanding to participate, and so because of those reasons, it's very user friendly. Now, in terms of the requirements on the business side, they're exactly the same in terms of being concrete and actionable. So a business wants to, or rather enterprise implementations of blockchain, specifically Ethereum, are, as Natalia just described, prioritized when they save or make money, when there is provable results. And so what that means is that the data that gets spat out of a blockchain application on Mainnet, that is used for whatever business experiment, needs to be able to clearly demonstrate value. And now I know this sounds silly. When a business adopts a new tool, it should be a useful tool. But I'm sure we've all seen a number of examples where businesses have gone off on blockchain pilots that have not necessarily been meaningful or relevant to their core business, and have not provided results because they failed to define how exactly they were planning to get to that objective goal of using blockchain. And I think often people, especially enterprises, conflate what is possible with blockchain with other fourth industrial revolution technologies. I'm sure Robby can speak to this at great length, but from like machine learning to intelligent analytics, like virtual reality, augmented reality, blockchain, like you throw all these buzzwords in a row, and I think a lot of enterprises sometimes fail to view them in the same way that they view their other service and data vendors, as the technical provider of a service or a function and some sort of output that I should make business decisions based on. So when it comes to those sort of features or functions that enterprises want or need from their blockchain implementations, it's that provable value. And if there's data that's being produced as a function of this app, that data needs to tell the business how to make more money, how to become more secure, how to be more efficient. You can't just implementing more security for the sake of more security is great, but it needs to have a business consequence to really matter. So is it that you decrease the liability of your organization's exposure with the PII that you're storing by using blockchain and immutable database? Is it that your business insurance decreased because the cost of the risk of exposure decreased using immutable documentation and a secure encryption technique? So I think drawing a clearer line between blockchain applications and those clear business values is going to be part of the battle. But I think the other thing in terms of what companies are expecting is that their teams will be able to competently engage with this technology moving forward, right? So if I'm a business and I want to adopt email, I'm going to operate under the assumption that my teams are going to be able to use that email moving forward. With blockchain, it requires a pretty significant basic understanding in order to truly engage, especially at a technical level. And so if we're talking about companies needing to or wanting to adopt blockchain apps, part of that is those teams also need to adopt the knowledge or expertise to engage with those apps, unless they're planning to farm that out forever. And Robby can speak to this more in his discussion of technical implementation. But one of the challenges that I've observed in terms of organizations being skittish about adopting blockchain is that blockchain platforms, tools, apps present too much of a new subject matter lift for their engineering teams or for their IT teams. And so, I mentioned earlier that talent is a challenge. Companies either need to hire blockchain engineers or train them up and hope they'll learn on the way up, but both are risky. And so if blockchain dApps can be delivered to enterprises in a way that limits the extent to which their internal teams need to develop new expertise, that's much more palatable to them. We don't want to have to teach them 85 new languages just to get on the bus. And so we need to make it accessible not only to those end users, but also accessible to those individuals within the enterprise setting whose job it is to integrate and apply and track these use cases.
Great. So now we have gotten the product view. Robby, would like to hear sort of like the technical view. You have the business requirements, you have the feature requirements. Now, how the heck you're gonna put that round peg into that square hole?
Yeah. And I think from a product view as well, the reason why we don't see as many niche or product market fit applications coming from the blockchain space is because there is a misconnect or a disconnect between the operational focus of many businesses that are trying to use blockchain and the user-centric and more commercial focus that layman consumers have. We haven't gotten to the point yet where there's an intersection between the two, and when we do see that, that's when we see a particular case study. From an engineering point of view, one thing that I've made it a goal is basically to use what's called product methodology, and it's something that I used at Consensus and we use it at Emerging Impact, which is basically making sure that those base requirements, those business requirements that engineers typically don't interface with, right? Oftentimes engineers don't even know what those are. They're just told to build something, right? Taking those base requirements, usually they're benefits. I want to do this, I want to operationalize this, and mapping it to the capabilities of the technology even before you start, coding at all, right? And that's where that solution architecture is extremely important. So the product methodology process is basically understanding the methodology of the organization. That could be an NGO that literally has no tech team, or it could be, an IBM or a Goldman Sachs, as I said before, and then understanding the traditional product design process that you go through if you were building anything, right? Let alone something with blockchain, and merging those two so that there's a lot of synergy between what you're hoping to create and what actually comes out of it in terms of the benefits. I think as it comes to Mainnet and the technicalities, it is limiting, right? That you have to leverage solidity when you see other blockchain ecosystems supporting deterministic languages outside of that, right? That's a huge plus. But until we start to see the intersection between what organizations are focused on and what commercial applications can actually exist in the future, we're probably going to continue to see this inconsistency in terms of user experience. The last thing I would say is that one thing that is very unique when it comes to blockchain technology, particularly smart contracts, is that engineers have to be closer to understanding what those business outcomes are. Before, that wasn't as true because you weren't literally moving money, right? You weren't doing these value transfers that required such a heightened sense of accountability, but now you are. And we perfectly see it in protocols like the token curated registry, right? Literally a protocol to make a good quality list. That's all it's trying to do, right? But because it's made from an engineering mindset, there's a lot of inputs that normal users wouldn't know. They don't know what a salt is or anything like that. They just want to use it. So some of these kind of game theory-esque implementations that we see in smart contracts are too technical and have too grave of user experience effects on the front end. And it's because those engineers haven't necessarily been a part of those client conversations, those partner conversations that are usually segregated in biz dev and not necessarily bridged into engineering Scrum. So that's something that I definitely think is going to have to change. Is that people on both sides, when it comes to the team building the product, are going to have hybrid skills. Everyone should know what those benefits are, and everyone really needs to be more of a part of the product development process rather than segregating, biz dev to designer to engineer, because that's where that miscommunication is happening. That, in addition to that disconnect of operational focus and commercial focus, I think are two huge reasons why we don't see many applications that are well adopted.
So, in other words, you're looking, or we need a closer working relationship and environment of collaboration, because the technology requires collaboration. Is that what you're saying? So that you need to have more business understanding and technical understanding, and that people are not used to being sort of like product ninjas, so to speak.
An example of what you just mentioned, I had a front seat on. We were trying to recreate a streaming platform using blockchain, and it just wasn't connecting for some reason. The platform wasn't working for many reasons, but then I had found out that our lead front-end engineer didn't use a single streaming platform. He only purchased music. So when you looked at what we had built versus what the needs were for what we were building, there was two completely separate products and they didn't align at all. And I'm sure that that instance wasn't the only instance in blockchain land of engineers building products for themselves as opposed to for what the actual problem is and what the solution would need to be. So that was one of my first kind of eye-opening moments, switching over from working in the music industry to working in tech, where I was like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. How can you try and fix a problem if you're not even familiar with the problem itself? So that must happen all over the place in many different forms. That was just one experience that I had, which made me kind of realize that we need to rework the way that we build products. At least in my division that I worked on.
So here's a segueing on that, and now taking a larger step back, looking at the genesis of like the blockchains from like the cyberpunk movement and anarchist, rebellious, everybody for themselves point of view. Has that, in your guys' opinion, not led to a big onus being put on the end user to actually understand the technology? Because you control everything yourself, right? And people just don't want that, or they're just not ready, or our entire society is not set up for, it's like self-control, but it's all about delegation and not really giving a shit because other people have taken care of the stuff that we normally take care of for us. So is that also, could that also be one of the reasons that there's a big disconnect between what the technology demands versus where people's minds are at? Evin, you're mute.
Sorry. It's a good question, Andreas. I definitely think, the sort of cypherpunk hyper independence that brought a lot of us to this space certainly persists. I know for myself, like my personal journey down the rabbit hole started before I had ever heard of Bitcoin. I started a group at my school called Students for Free Culture, and we were, devout information freedom fighters, battling against the evils of paid journal repositories and academic, institutions withholding data from the public that had been publicly funded. But then I quickly realized that, as I was introduced to Bitcoin and then eventually Ethereum, that there could exist, a universe of free flow of information that was liberated from these imposing centralized authorities. But of course, the opposite of that nanny state that you describe, one where everything's taken care of for us, everything's provided to us as a service, and we just pay in our attention. If we were to move away from that, of course, it necessarily requires a level of independent autonomy and participation from everyone that demands literacy, both technical and verbal and contextual. It certainly also demands a level of responsibility and ownership of our digital footprint, our presence in the world, the actions and consequences that impact us in a way that kind of takes away the bumpers. Right? We're talking about the challenge of key management. That's what happens when you take away the bumpers of centralized authority. You are responsible for your own password. And if you are not, grown up enough to handle that alphanumeric string in some way, then you're going to have a tough time. So I definitely think that, so if anyone watching has never read John Perry Barlow's A Declaration of Independence in Cyberspace, I highly recommend it. It is one of these sort of pivotal cypherpunk texts that addresses the governments of the industrial world and describes a decentralized movement, led by the people toward a better way. And I think that ethos persists in many. I think that in order to achieve mass adoption, we can't lead with it. And I think that we'll continue to explore the sliding scale between simplicity and privacy. And I think those who are, sort of answering the carrion call to lead forth in a new way are likely to lean toward the side of privacy, to take on greater individual responsibility, to educate themselves and to learn, new ways of being participatory in the universe and taking control of their data and what happens to it. And not only their data, but their expression in the world. And then on the other side of that spectrum, we're going to see those who are, my moms of the world, people who are looking, to technology as a happy helper, not necessarily seeking, a great new political autonomy by using their iPhones. But that doesn't mean that they deserve any less privacy, security, protection, data autonomy. That doesn't mean that they should have unequal protection under the law when it pertains to the rights and responsibilities given to them with respect to their data, especially those citizens in places like the EU and California where those rights are greater. And so, I think that instead of trying to replace the spectrum between privacy and security, we should instead just try to scoot the whole spectrum along toward the privacy side of things. So we still need to make sure that usability and accessibility and catering to the mass is at the forefront, but it doesn't necessarily need to be done in a way that disregards or ignores the origin where we began this, this cypherpunk, cyberpunk, hyper-independent, anti-establishment movement of people trying to build tools that could not be interrupted by central authorities. However, I also recognize, to the point of our gathering here today, blockchain necessarily, and those values that drove, the cypherpunk movement necessarily undermine the enterprises that we're trying to get to adopt the candy. It's a little bit of a Trojan horse, right? We are introducing a threat to declining profitability. Blockchain necessarily, it delivers negligible transaction costs without a need for outside authority. And so that undermines this premise of traditional industries that are necessary to be part of transactions, that participate in those transaction costs. So I think we gotta keep the punk, keep blockchain punk, but we must do so in a way that that cares for the least tech literate among us.
And to add on that a little bit, I've seen this a lot, and especially in terms of at the detriment of user experience, is that decentralized maximalism has made user experience worse. Because, and what people really need to understand is that you cannot have, underlying philosophy should not take precedence over good user experience. And we see that a lot. We say, oh, well, we're trying to establish this type of game theory with this underlying philosophy, so people need to be okay with signing transactions on the front end, or staking tokens in a way that's foreign to them in terms of processes that they've gone through in the past, and not saying that that's like a vote or saying that that's a point where rather than token, even all the way to our terminology. And if we don't let that go, we're not going to see good adoption, or we're going to see projects die more quickly. So that's really important as well. Is you have to completely separate your philosophy, look at the user experience requirements first, the business requirements first, the user requirements first, and that should be the foundation for any features you have. And then as a decentralized architecture becomes more capable, because right now it's really not, you can move toward that, right? But that's a developer conversation within the organization. That's not something that you pull in a client, right, to discuss, right? They don't really care, unfortunately. And I think a perfect example that we have, and I know that you all may be familiar with, is Project Unblock Cash, which we did in Vanuatu. And this is when we're dealing with an organization that is completely non-technical, right? But they do have certain expenses that they want to operationalize and minimize. They're dealing with a high vulnerable community, most of which are either not connected to the internet or have low literacy, right? But they still want to use, right, digital money, right, or cryptocurrency as their underlying, cash transfer, cash assistance, process. So how do you accomplish all those three things? You're not going to have full decentralization, right? Because you need to understand the donor reporting requirements as to where their money is going, how money is spent. You do need, KYC processes in some instances. And I'm sure in the future, 5-10 years from now, we will find ways to do that in a way that's less controlled by one entity. But I think you have to take a step back and say, we're going to relinquish this part of our philosophy because it's going to make the application work now. And we're going to work toward what our ideal state is. So that way you at least have a user community at the beginning that's going to go on, with you on the journey, even if they're doing so, unknowingly. Yeah, that's my 2 cents. But yes, I mean, amazing points. Absolutely, I agree.
The only thing I'll add, because I agree with both of everything I said, is yes, keep it punk, and I guess by that, decentralize everything. But I also think, centralization isn't a bad thing as long as there's transparency. And if we just create and allow transparency, if some things are central, it's actually much easier to be able to access them and know where they are and to form communities around them. So again, I think it's all about, taking things like there needs to be a balance between everything. We can't just go shift everything over to this decentralized blockchain experimental Web3 world. We're just not ready. It's like we're trying to get to Mars before we've colonized the moon. We're just not ready. So I think we just need to really like work on balance, and first and foremost is UX. And I think that anyone working on any kind of blockchain product, the UX designer, the UX front-end person, that should be like the most important hire, just from my experience, because you are overestimating people's intelligence. And if you look at what's going on in the real world with TikTok and people giving away their Face ID to look like a cat, I mean, people are giving away all their personal data right now, and they don't really notice it. And I don't think they really care. I mean, even when you're going to like, you know, to an article online and it gives you the option to actually pick and choose what data you give up, I guarantee you 90% of users don't even bother to click that. They just accept whatever the fine print is. So you really have to, unfortunately, appeal to the lowest common denominator here for mass adoption. And you have to just assume that everybody has, you know, limited knowledge and is just looking for like that dopamine hit, that quick fix, that time saver, that money maker, that money saver, whatever it is. And that all really begins and ends with clear and efficient UX design.
I want to sort of like bring all of what we said together in a hypothetical scenario, but maybe that might come true. So you know, there's let's say there's an X prize for $10 million, and the challenge is build an end consumer facing application that can support, you know, 10 million users, but it has to use Mainnet. Where would we start? What will we do, and how will we do it?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Peter Diamandis for dedicating so many resources toward the development of Ethereum mainnet. I knew he was interested.
I talked with Peter, and he was like so up for it, and he's hitting up Vitalik and Joe to put up the 10 million.
Perfect. Forget the moon. Let's go to mainnet.
Let's go to Mainnet as our digital moon.
I'll jump in real quick. So snark aside, but really, Peter Diamandis, if you're watching this, hit us up. I think that an initial, you know, step toward Mainnet would just be, or an incredible way to get, you know, 10 million users on it would be to provide an obligatory government service. I think that, you know, integrating some sort of secure identity program on Mainnet would be a fascinating way to enforce both transparency, because if it's publicly funded, then you have a vice grip on the party that is participating and expressing that work. So I would be of course very concerned if that was contracted out to a private.
I'm terribly sorry. I totally forgot to mention you only got 12 months.
Oh, you have 12 months. Oh man, okay.
So forget the government for a second here, because it's like we don't have 10 years, right?
If that were the case, I mean, the first thing that I would say is we as a community need to understand the reality and the extent of sharding. Not to get too technical, right? But we always talk about like, oh, you know, if we do this and we add this to it and we add this recipe, right, we'll reach the 2 million, right, that, you know, Visa's been doing, right, for the past decade in terms of transaction throughput. But I really do think that, and you saw it in the last DEF CON, it's a conversation that we've been avoiding because ETH 2.0 has been going a little bit slower than we all imagined. But we really need to have a real conversation about we have to separate computation from state. We have to just understand that there are going to be some companies, right, that are layer 2 companies, and they're going to process a lot of our transactions. But in order to get 10 million, I mean, there's so many, even if they were doing one transaction a month, right? Like, and everyone was communicating, like, hey, don't do any transactions yet. Like, we need to, you know, Mainnet won't be able to take it. That's one of the only ways. And I know that requires a lot of refactoring. I know that requires, you know, understanding that maybe the direction that we had gone wasn't necessarily the right one. But it's something that worries me, because we're starting to see niche solution blockchains start to come up. Algorand is a perfect example, right? When it comes to security tokens, right? And compliance, we're starting to see blockchains rise up that are starting to take away these use cases that I think Ethereum allowed possible via the ERC20 and all the other standards that came out. And if those gain, a lot of popularity, and those are seen as the standard, then that's just another use case that's taken away, right, from Mainnet. But I do agree, that there haven't been enough government and social sector use cases that would need to rely on that for the long term. And that's how you easily get people on, especially with social protection programming like unemployment, EBT. We saw this during COVID, right? People were mailing checks out that didn't get to some people in a month. It's insane. We spent over $200 million in ACH transfer fees that could have otherwise gone to people who were sick or who were unemployed, right? All of us thinking that $1,200 was going to get everybody to 2021 for those who needed it. So I think there's a lot of use cases that we ignore because we see the shiny things like tokenized derivatives that Mainnet could actually support. But before that happens, there has to be both a technical and a user experience conversation as to how do we realistically get transaction throughput up? What does Ethereum have to let go in order to do that? And, in which layer 2 partners, do we need to support to get there? As boring as a conversation that might be to some people, is a very real one. And we're at a threat of literally losing, quote unquote market share, if you want to, term, the user community in that way, to enterprise Ethereum off of Ethereum Mainnet, right? We could live in a world in the future where enterprise Ethereum very much still is a thing, but Ethereum Mainnet isn't. And that's sad, right? Because all of this kind of came from that. So that's my 2 cents. It's definitely a conversation that's needed.
Yeah, you jumped right away to the how. It's like being a good technologist that you are. You just jumped right to that. But it's like since I shut down Evin's Where, because the X Prize only gives you like 12 months, right? So you need to prove that it can reach that. So Natalia, where would you start if we formed like an X Prize team, right? Where would you recommend that we start? We just lost Evin because her internet is shoddy.
I mean, yeah, I don't. Yeah, the time is definitely a constraint given how it takes to build everything. In an ideal world, yeah, I would want to tackle things like unemployment, where there's so much fraud that happens there, and the government has no way of judging it besides your social security number. But again, I guess we don't have time for that. I mean, I would like to take a closer look at fan engagement and certain artists and certain people command, I mean, the Jenners have, 300 million in their network, just on Instagram. So if you were to be able to create, a connection with someone that has a large fan base or has a large microphone to a lot of people, perhaps a simple engagement tool would be a way to get people on Mainnet without even realizing that they're using blockchain.
Right. I think that's where sort of like baseline and what we've been talking about at EthATL here has come in, something really boring, something very simple, but that everybody can somehow use, and it preserves privacy. So the what is then really, so if we're saying so we're starting something around engagement, then is that's the where. The what would be what would be the what? What are we going to do there? Right? It's like what do we build? So we would need someone with a large platform of people, and what do we need to be able to provide in terms of value to that individual or individuals and to their followers, right? Because I don't know. Kim Kardashian probably doesn't open up her network for like nilly willy stuff, even though if you probably get out an AMA for her or a dinner with her out for something like that, you probably get to 10 million really, really quick.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, I guess just something that, you know, verifies your engagement, verifies that you've interacted with the product or something. I mean, that was a project that we're working on in Consensus. I think, again, it just depends on the audience that you integrate with, but there is a lot of people out there that follow the entertainment space, so.
Another thing, at least in terms of like, you know, the where or the what that I've seen, that could potentially scale, you know, on Ethereum, or if we use a POA network or whichever, is just cash assistance, right? It's one of the most basic forms of aid that every government supports, every NGO supports. Entities that have access to tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people at a time. We saw this with building blocks, right, with the World Food Program a few years ago. What they did in Jordan with refugee camps, that was 200,000 people. So I think the audiences that need basic financial services are there. I think sometimes when we think of like 10 million users or just users in general, we're thinking in the context like in a Western mindset, right?
Mm-hmm.
The issue is that the technology hasn't matured enough to replace a lot of the centralized conveniences that we have today. We have driver's licenses, we have Visa, right? We have Uber, we have Airbnb, and those work perfectly fine. But, you know, people in extremely rural areas or agrarian-based economies, they don't have any of those things, right? Even the simplest, even like sending money, right? And I think that's where we start. I know that, you know, EthATL and others have commented on we shouldn't be too DeFi focused, but I do think that is the lowest hanging fruit on the tree when it comes to mainstream adoption, especially if you have conduit organizations like NGOs and, you know, the World Bank and, you know, the UN, right, who literally do have access to onboard 1 million people onto a particular system. You know, but that's my 2 cents. Obviously, I'm biased because I'm social.
No, but you're making a good point. So you know, to wrap the things up and to let the viewers who will view this with food for thought, maybe both can be combined, right? So you can have the Western world engaged audiences with the tech capability engage and thereby helping out the disadvantaged people that need that assistance, and therefore you're bringing together an ecosystem of participants that would allow you to bring really meaningful, not only meaningful scale, but you know, get the dopamine hit on the one hand, and the you know, payments via SMS to the or even simpler, you know, to the people who really need it. I think the technical capabilities are in principle there, right? If you look at layer 2 solutions, they can process, you know, a few thousand transactions a second if they have to, and that means you just have more operators, right? So it's all there. It's just the willingness to go out and do something really boring and get an ecosystem together. That's the hard part, in my opinion. And so as the moderator, I give myself the last word here, and I want like to thank you for the time, despite the technical challenges. Thank you so much for joining. I hope this has been fun, has been for me, also educational. You know, it's like it's great. It's great to discuss, to think about, and then hope for not only hope for, but actually do something about it. So, and I know both of you will do that. So I'm very hopeful for the future, whether it's on Mainnet or not. So
absolutely appreciate it.
Thank you very much to the two of you, and those who are watching. Thank you for spending that time with us.
Thank you.